Hi, so I guess I should catch up on the rest of programming language news from 2023. Well, at least some amount of it beyond just the top 10. And some languages after the top 10, I see Kotlin, Swift, R, Dart, and more. Poor Ruby has fallen from its heights. So if we take off some of these that have higher bumps, it's easier to see what's left. And we definitely see Kotlin growing, as well as Docker files, which is a programming language of a sort. Going quickly through additional stats, we see Objective-C blowing out that next group, and poor Scala is still on a downward trend, again by whatever stats I have here. If I take away Scala and poor Haskell with its spike, although noting that it's been a little stable recently, we see solid steady performance for VBA in recent couple years, growth for CMake, and a big spike of GDScript. And focusing just on certain well-known functional languages, again we have Scala and Haskell that if we take off, we next see a drop down of Clojure, and we see Elixir holding somewhat steady recently, maybe a slight downward trend on many of these. I've often said this may be due to more mainstream languages picking up functional features. And here's just a completely different mix-up of array/data languages, often say for scientific or numerical purposes, where R after Python is the biggest. And at least from the stats I grab at GitHub and Stack Overflow, MATLAB and Julia have been fairly close to each other in recent years, although this may not be fully representative of either language, obviously. And then just simply going down further on the list of the next group of languages in terms of popularity, we see Perl has dropped, but some other languages here are rising. Zig, for example, has a steady upward trend with occasional spikes beyond that. And then there's this language called Ballerina, which has come out of nowhere. I'd not really even paid attention to it. So we're going to take a look at that later. That one got me by surprise. It's sort of like a web services integration language, but it seems to be a full-featured programming language as well. And then here's a focus on various languages that I pay special attention to. And some of these are systems languages, but not all of them might fit in that category. Haxe with its spike blows up the chart a little bit. And again, Zig has some spikes as well, but overall an upward trend. And worth remembering that even these languages that I don't get a lot of activity for in the stats I follow, still sometimes have very active communities and solid development going on. Anyway, for a quick run through news. Kotlin, in addition to having a couple of releases last year, put out its alpha release for WebAssembly or WASM support. I think we'll continue to see various languages emphasizing this. Swift also had a couple releases, including things like regex literals and macros. Dart had a few releases, especially Dart 3, with full null safety and records and patterns, as well as some WASM planning for the future. Ruby had its standard release on Christmas, which focused on a new parser for Ruby itself, as well as improved JIT support. Scala also interestingly had its 3.3 release, which is the first long-term support release, as well as various other changes. And as I mentioned in my last video, GDScript got a lot of attention in the past year. It gets its releases along with the Godot game engine, which had its 4.0 release last year. Among the improvements are improved static typing, as well as static variables to share across class instances, and improved debugging within the Godot editor. Haskell also saw a release last year, and among the many things in it was typed numeric literals. And Elixir saw a couple of releases, as usual focusing just on core infrastructure of the language and ecosystem. But they've also been actively working on adding gradual static typing to the language. With a bit of a spoiler alert from January 8th of this year, that apparently they've merged this in some fashion, so I expect we'll see more serious announcements about this in the next Elixir release. And OCaml followed up its very big 5.0 release with a 5.1, including things like restored support for RISC-V architecture. They also published a platform roadmap, where among other things they've said they want to focus on Dune as the only tool users need to develop in OCaml. fsharp 8 came out with the latest .NET release, including a handful of language features, such as this property shorthand, or explicit markers for expected tail call optimization. And Julia had some releases as well, perhaps the most interesting new thing being the caching of native code, which enables faster startup time for Julia apps. And back to this Ballerina I mentioned earlier. It's an open source cloud native programming language optimized for integration, rich ecosystem of network protocols. Their goal really is to help you connect web services, including a lot of well-known ones out there. They have some built-in integrations. And I haven't studied the language in detail. Here's a quick glance at some of what it looks like. And in terms of other languages out of the blue, last year, Chris Latner, the initial creator of the Swift language, announced a new programming language called Mojo, focused on AI applications, but really it's sort of like a Rust or C++ language, except it looks like Python, and tries to do a fair amount of Python interaction as well, with the idea that people who are comfortable with Python could move into Mojo. And they emphasize a lot of parallel execution, high performance, and that includes GPU as well as CPU. It's not yet open source, although they've said they want to make it that. And so there's their def main, which looks a lot like Python. But if you look at the docs much, you'll see there's a lot more complexity into the language itself beyond what you might expect in Python. And Zig had its 0.11 release last year, which it chose to put out with bug fixes and a variety of language changes as well, although not including the async await and suspend resume support, which has been deferred to a future release. And in terms of big news, NIM 2.0 came out, where it now defaults to the cyclical reference counting memory management, although still configurable. And they also were able to make various other changes to the defaults of language behavior. If I understand correctly, you can still use NIM 1.x dependencies in a NIM 2.0 application or library. Haxe also had a release last year, 4.3, with a number of implemented language proposals. The Crystal language saw some releases, including some core language features, but perhaps more interesting for some people is the significant advances to support in Windows, including upgrading to LLVM 18 that allows linking LLVM dynamically on Windows. There's also some additional just DLL support that they put into this release as well. And the D language, of course, saw its regular release cycle, and it's hard to keep up with all the specifics going on here, but the language does stay under very active development. And the V programming language, probably the first time I've actually mentioned it in a video ever on my channel. And I'm not going to get into the controversy around it in the past. That's part of why I haven't covered it before. But at this point, they really have continued to maintain the language. I can't give any opinions on it right now, and I haven't tracked the details much, but it does continue to stay under active development. Now the Odin language, which I have used before, also saw its regular monthly release cycle, with various cool things like Raylive being updated to 4.5, and a handful of small language changes, and work on using the tilde backend as an alternative, though not replacement, for LLVM, with the idea that other backends might be faster at code generation than LLVM is. Zig, for example, has also announced an interest in not depending on LLVM. And looking at a variety of other languages that I don't have on my stats at all, there's C3, which is yet another C alternative language out there. And one thing that makes it a little bit different from, say, Odin or Zig or others is the trying to stay a little bit closer to well-known C language workflows, like, for example, linking of binary libraries instead of just emphasizing full source compilation. And I'm still a fan of the small Roland language, which continues to be under development. Another language I still need to get around to sometime is Vale, which has interesting strategies for memory safety. The Rock language, which I have tried out some and I'm a big fan of. I'm curious to see where it keeps going. The Gleam language, which is a statically typed language for the Erlang/Beam virtual machine. It's been under active development. And one of the cool things they added recently was an interactive language tour, although I cheated and this is from January. So Gleam is written in Rust, and they've compiled this to WASM as well. And we see it's actually rather small, at less than 4 megabytes in size, and downloads at just over a megabyte for doing the interactive language tour in the browser. And there's a few languages focused on concurrency that I really want to try out sometime. I have used Pony a little bit, but not nearly enough. Inko is also interesting to me, as well as another language I run across called Claro, because concurrency is a difficult task, and I find it interesting there's a lot of languages that try to emphasize focusing on making concurrency easier and more reliable. So maybe I'll get a chance to look into those sometime. Anyway, just a quick review of some of the languages out there and what happened to them in 2023. Looking forward to a great 2024. If you like the video, be sure to subscribe. Bye y'all.